In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. King Uzziah was one of the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom of ancient Israel. He reigned well over 2,500 years ago, and although the length of his reign was not as long as that of Her late Majesty the Queen, it was still a pretty long reign. 52 years to be precise, we are told in the books of the Kings and the Chronicles. We're also told that it was a prosperous reign, and we are told that even though much of Uzziah's reign was marred by illness and even isolation, something that we've had to get used to, haven't we, over the last year or so with our own queen. But on the whole, King Uzziah was a good king, doing, quotes, what was right in the sight of the Lord. I wonder how the people of Judah, the prophet Isaiah included, felt at the end of this long and this good reign. Did they feel sad, maybe? Did they feel nostalgic? Maybe they were anxious. After all, 5 years earlier, there had been a new king in Assyria, an aggressively imperialist king who was threatening to invade Judah and Israel and all the surrounding area. Were they anxious about what was to come? Did it feel for them like the end of an era of peace and prosperity? Well, in the midst of all this sadness and anxiety, especially on the international front, God makes God's presence known in a very special way to the prophet Isaiah. We read of this in Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah dies, Isaiah has this amazing vision of God, which is one at the same time terrifying and reassuring. God is described as high and mighty. He's accompanied by mysterious angelic creatures and smoke and tremors. And yet his robe fills the temple. Though awesome and majestic, God is present with God's people in the place of worship. Furthermore, in this vision, God sits on a throne. A reminder, a reassurance maybe, that whoever happens to be in power, God is the true sovereign, and God's reign never ends. How does the prophet react to this vision? He cries, "Woe is me, I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." In contrast to the awesome holiness of God, the prophet is all too aware of his own unholiness and the unholiness of his generation. Unclean lips suggests an unhealthy relationship with the truth. Despite King Uzziah's goodness, he had been presiding, it seems, over an increasingly dishonest and deceitful people. But God does not leave the prophet in this abject state. Instead, God takes the prophet's sense of guilt away. God cleanses his speech, and God gives him fresh purpose, a new commission, to be an ambassador of God's truth amongst God's people. This is the message of the Bible, time and again. God does not leave us in our misery, but rather God picks us up, brushes us down, and tells us to take responsibility and to go and make a difference in the world. Who shall I send? Today, over 2,500 years later, as we, like Isaiah and his people, stand at the end of a long and righteous and prosperous reign, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, maybe wondering what the future will hold, certainly anxious about many things, especially on the international front, maybe also all too aware of how much truth and decency and honesty have taken a battering in our public life in recent years. I pray for a vision like Isaiah's. I pray for a vision of the true King who sits on an eternal throne, high and mighty, and yet available to his people in mercy and compassion and forgiveness, and empowering his people to return to ways of truth and goodness. I pray for such a vision for our new King, Charles III. Like his mother, may he reign with that knowledge that there is somebody much bigger and much better than him. I pray for this vision for our new government. I pray for this vision for all world leaders, so many of them gathering or already gathered in London as I speak for the Queen's funeral tomorrow. And I pray for such a vision for you and for me. Elsewhere in the Bible, in the book of Proverbs, we are told that without a vision, the people perish. The implication being that with a vision, the people flourish. Tomorrow, as we say goodbye to our late, long-reigning and God-fearing monarch at her funeral, may we all be reassured and encouraged and empowered by a fresh vision of the God she so faithfully served and reflected in her own life. Like Queen Elizabeth II, like King Uzziah, like the prophet Isaiah before her, may we all be encouraged to say to our awesome, forgiving, and empowering God, in all the changes and challenges and opportunities that lie ahead, here am I. Send me. Amen.